Namaste. Analysis and philosophy, object loss. Object loss was, as a theme, was once central to Kleinian psychotherapists, but over time it got pushed into the margins of discourse in psychoanalysis. Well, still, there are some in the field who believe in centrality of object loss as a part of causality. Our psychoanalysis consultant, Mr. Himanshu Vaidya, is surely one amongst them. So let us discuss this theme with him today. Namaste, Mr. Vaidya.
Namaste.
Mr. Vaidya, can we begin with the question, what is object loss in psychoanalysis?
Before we go to object loss, I think we should go to object and then look at loss and then put the whole phrase object loss before us. When we say object in psychology, particularly in psychoanalysis, we mean any entity with which the mind engages. And that entity, whether it is a human being or it is an animal or it is an inanimate object or it is just an idea or just a feeling, all those entities are thought of as objects in a very broad sense of the term. In general sense of the term, if you narrow it down a bit, then you call those entities objects with whom you are trying to relate. So when we use the word object for a person in psychoanalysis, we don't intend in any way to reduce the person or humiliate the person. That is how it might appear to somebody outside of psychology. That you are objectifying somebody, reducing somebody, humiliating somebody by calling that person an object. But this is not so. When we say object, it is an entity of engagement. So this is the object in psychoanalysis. Now the engagement can be of various types. You can be thinking about an object, you can be feeling about an object, you can be thinking about how to behave with it and behave with it simultaneously. You may be recollecting or something of your past. You may be thinking of a situation in future. So you engage with objects in a variety of ways: cognitive, emotional, behavioral, intellectual, and so on. Now, when we look at the word loss, loss necessarily does not mean that we have lost it completely. And why is this so important? Because once we have defined an object, naturally two things come up: object gain, object maintenance, and object loss. Three things come up. That once we have found an object in the real world or in the internal world, then how our relationship with that object is going to be. So if we can gain an object, we can lose an object, we can just maintain something with an object. And object gain, object loss, object maintenance, all of these are very important elements of our life. In fact, there are various views on human nature, and one of the views is that we are essentially object-seeking creatures, more than drive-driven creatures. So Klein used to say that, contrary to Freud, who looked at man as a drive-driven creature, Klein looked at man as an object-seeking creature. And when we look at Winnicott, when we look at Bowlby, we see the same kind of echo there. That man is essentially an object-seeking creature. And one of the worst things that we fear is the fear of object loss and abandonment. And this we see that we are not able to live happily alone. We feel very lonely when we don't have objects around us. When objects leave us, when objects shame us and tell us that we are not good enough. So all those elements are elements human beings are extremely afraid of. or when objects attack us. So our happiness and pain to a great deal depends upon what kind of object treatment we get from our objects. How good or not good our object world is. That is a very big source of our pleasure and pain. Just as objective world of being able to eat, live well, have shelter, which is another package of our happiness. So just as fundamental drive satisfaction is one area of our happiness, much larger than that is the package of object relations, which is a very important element of our well-being and happiness. So this is how the objects are important. In fact, there are experiments which show with monkeys that baby monkeys, when they are alternatively put to situations of loss of nourishment versus loss of object, they are able to cope with loss of nourishment better than coping up with loss of objects. So this object loss is so intense a phenomena with mammals that at times it's even more intense than the survival drive or the biological drives that we have. Now, once we have this perspective, we come to this whole idea of object loss, that what object loss is. Literally, object loss can be when somebody is lost forever. Let us say somebody dies. That's a literal and total object loss. Let us say somebody abandons, parents abandon a child, and the child is taken to an orphanage. That is a second category of object loss where the object is not dead, but dead in a psychological and social sense, even though alive in a biological sense. The third is that there may be distance created between us and somebody. And the distance is interpreted as loss and in extreme cases as abandonment. Fourth is people abandon us or leave us, not abandon us, but they leave us because uh, we don't get along with them, they don't get along with us, or both of us just find each other incompatible. So that is another area of object loss. We can also come to non-human object loss. For example, we get attached to our cars, our scooters, our vehicles, and so on. We get attached to our homes, our hostels. We can get attached to our pets. And when they either die or they are broken or they are lost, again we feel the pain of the object loss. So that's a different situation of object loss, a non-human object loss. We can even feel the object loss in terms of an ideology we like when the party representing the ideology loses out and maybe disintegrates. It may be even a book that once upon a time we used to like so much. So object loss comprises a broad range of phenomena where any object, be it in outside real world or in our mind, to what we are attached in some way, that object is lost either because of its destruction or because of its decision to be away from us or because of circumstances or in the natural course of events or just because of incompatibility between the two. In whatever degree the separation happens, the object loss is felt. So we are constantly in this flux of fusion and loss. And we have to find this optimum zone in between. And both are difficult, but loss is more frequent and easy to consciously understand and feel. Fusion difficulties are more difficult to fathom, more rare, and very deep in terms of their location in our mind. But object loss is a very pervasive human event which happens in everyone's life. It is one of the very difficult events both for ordinary life and for psychopathology.
Mr. Vaidya, there is a question I have regarding this. I have heard many old people like 70 plus age group talking about childhood as if, it's a loss. So, I mean, can it fall into this category? I mean, childhood as an object loss feeling?
because because the memories of those events are like objects in the mind. They are psychological objects, not real world objects. So I have seen many people, somebody very near to where I live, he was very sick and very old, and doctors had told him it's not long to go. So he decided to go back to his village because he wanted a closure and he wanted to die there. Although he lived in the city for most of his life, in the heart of his heart, he could never forget his childhood and his village where he grew up. So for him, the coming from the village to the city was a very big object loss of that dear village which was so dear to him. And that is the story of millions of Indians who come from villages to the cities. I also know of many people who are never able to forget the first place they used to live in. Take my own example. I used to live in a society for the first 20 years of my life, and thereafter I shifted to a new place to live. But I am still nostalgic about the first place I used to live, and I have never been able to attach to this present place as much as I used to get attached to that earlier place. Similarly, for my first cycle and my first bike, I could never get equally attached to subsequent products. So I think there is uh, a basket full of objects, both human, non-human, to whom you were attached once upon a time, and which we have not mourned enough. I think each of us carries a basket full of unmourned object losses.
Uh, Actually, it's a very profound kind of loss. I mean, it's when we are talking, one just realizes this. These are very day to day living experiences of every human being. And
And,
when you talk, yes,
and there is no escape from this.
exactly, because basically it's like something you get attached to, and then you have to leave it, or it gets lost, and there is an object loss. So what we think is just the material objects, or the human beings or something, but I think it's far wider than that.
True. So the
If,
cycles of attachment, happiness, detachment, pain, or modifications of this cycle, they are always on. I mean, it's a part of being human.
yes, right.
Unless you are an enlightened person who is above desire and attachment, that's a different issue altogether. But for
Right.
ordinary people like you and me, this is the very central stuff of life.
It's a very day to day thing which we don't really think about in this perspective.
Yeah.
But when we are talking about it, it just strikes you that, I mean, there are so many little things in our day to day life which we are attached to, and we break away from the attachment, and it's a constant process, I feel.
And it's a very painful process. We repress the pain.
Yes. Or we are not even aware of it. It just happens and goes off. It happens and goes off.
That's what I'm saying. The pain
Right.
arises in the
Yeah.
conscious and repressed there. Doesn't come up to the consciousness. Awareness.
Okay. So it just automatically that whole process happens. All right. Okay. Okay. Okay, we come to our next question. Why do you believe in this concept to be central to psychoanalysis?
It is not something new that I believe in. A lot of people have talked about it. Practically every important psychoanalyst has talked about it. Take, for example, Freud talked about the presence or not presence of the mother and the element of trust and lack of trust in the oral phase, which we don't give much importance to because we are focused more on the Oedipal phase. Then you talked about the, the reality of the mother and that how that affects on activation of the maternal archetype and the child archetype. and how a failure in that element creates problems. Winnicott talked about good enough mothering. Kohut talked about mirroring and idealizing parents, empathic parents, self-object experience giving parents. And obviously, Klein made it to be one of our central premises of internalization of a good, reliable, stable object to be the centerpiece of psychological and physical health. So this has been the flow in psychoanalysis. Unfortunately, it has slightly gone out of fashion. And that is where the internalization of a good, reliable, stable object, which is at the core of psychological health and also physical health, that needs to be revisited. And I think people are slowly realizing this. We see in ISTDP, many other forms of experiential dynamic therapies that people are realizing the centrality of internalizing the good, reliable, stable object and early life loss of a good object and its consequences to be at the center of pathology development. So when we look at any category of pathologies, be it psychosis or personality disorders or anxiety disorders, we realize in most categories, I'm not saying all, but in most categories, early life object relations becomes a central part of the story.
You just said that it has gone onto the, I mean, into the sidelines of psychoanalytical discourse. I mean, could you just say some reasons? I mean, why would such a thing happen since this is such a profound and central
Uh,
concept or a happening, rather, I would say.
yeah. So it got into psychoanalysis from a variety of ways and it keeps coming up again and again in various ways. But what happened is this: one, there was a lot of focus on drives, and then there was a lot of focus on defenses. And these two approaches that put the object relations on the sidelines. So we had a very powerful space occupied by drive-driven theories. Then we had quite a large space occupied by ego defense-driven theories. And later on, uh, when Winnicott came in and Kohut came in, they did not go so much into the internal dynamics of the objects. They went into the criticality of the object in the outer world, particularly the mother and the father. Mother for Winnicott and both of them for Kohut. But they did not go into the internal dynamics of the what happens in the object world inside the mind. So in all therapies, whether we like it or not, corrective experience always happens. People are afraid of the word corrective experience because they feel it will lead to a sin of commission, which is far worse than the sin of omission. However, there is no escaping the fact that approval, validation, compliance, and internalization of a good, reliable, stable object can't escape from these facts in therapy. It's inevitably happening in therapy. Whether you like it or not, you focus it or not, that's a different issue. But it's almost an inevitability that happens in therapy. The difficulty, not difficulty, but I think the difficulty of that, let me put it that way, was that once you focus on the object as an entity, object relations as an entity, then we go so deep because then we are looking at not only objects of the outside world, but objects of fantasy created inside. Because one of the characteristics of our mind is that we also create objects out of our fantasy, which may be a dream girl, a dream boy, or any fantastical object. And then there is a deeper layer still where the fantastical world is going on and it never reaches our awareness. The fantasies that we call with PH fantasy, not F fantasy. PHANTASY, not FANTASY. So there is a deeper unconscious world, and this is so subtle and so deep that it's not easy to investigate this world. And unless you have gone deep yourself, deep inside of you yourself, and really develop that ability to think and observe that world, you can't theorize on that. That has been the difficulty. That most people, they were not capable enough of investigating this world as much another group of people who were capable but did not find it persuasive. So there are both these reasons that some capable people did not think it persuasive and some people just were not capable enough, and that I think is a very large segment. That's very difficult to think in those terms. It's a very difficult area to think. That's one of the reasons why it has gone out of fashion. You have to be years inside of yourself to really be capable to think in those areas.
Right. Very true. Yeah. Okay. Next question. Why does object loss happen?
Uh, Object loss happens because life happens. Uh, we all want only object gain and object maintenance. Nobody wants an object loss. But despite our not wanting it to happen, it does happen. And it's a very painful thing to go through. And we try to minimize it, and we should try to minimize it. But it's a difficult thing to avoid because in the ultimate analysis, nobody and nothing is permanent. And people are going to abandon us or leave us, or the closeness between us is always going to be a variable. Maybe for 2 months we are very close and then we slightly go apart. This closeness is a very dynamic entity. And the other part of us is that on one hand we want closeness to be static, on the other hand we want variety. So we also get bored of objects. So just as on one hand we don't want object loss, on the other hand we want object variety because we are bored of objects. And all these paradoxes play out. And when the objects are around us, we seek variety. It is only when we actually lose the object we realize the difficulty of losing. When the objects are around, we treat them far less graciously than what we think about them when they are not there. So object losses therefore are inevitable. Say for example, there is no choice but to move out of your home to school, at least for a reasonable period of the day. There is no way that you cannot move from the school to the college. There is no way you cannot move from college to the profession. So at each place, there will be a different set of friends, a different set of colleagues, a different set of people around you. And every change involves object loss. Particularly people who have a transferable job or a mobile job, their children undergo a lot of object losses. And what happens is that unfortunately, after a few repetitions, the unconscious mind decides not to attach strongly to anything because it's too painful. And therefore, once this gets established, then you only have acquaintances, you don't really have deep relations. The fear of emotional closeness is fortified after 4 or 5 times this experience happens. So we don't want it, but we can't escape it.
Yeah.
We only can learn to manage this whole object business better. Object pursuit, object chase, object gain, object maintenance, object loss, and object mourning. This whole life cycle of object engagement.
So the process of living itself entails object loss, I think. Object gain, maintenance, and loss, and that whole thing, as you're seeing.
Because today we are talking about object loss. Similarly, we can talk about object desire, object gain, object maintenance, and object mourning.
Right.
This is the whole cycle.
Fine. Okay. Uh, how is object loss related to psychosis?
Many people believe that if you are not able to internalize a good, reliable, stable object in the first part of your childhood, say first 3 months or 4 months, then the stage for adult psychosis is already set. Now, this is very different from what people who believe in the biological cause of psychosis believe in. They believe in a completely different story. But those who trace psychosis to early childhood, there is one group of people who do that, and they believe that early life internalization of a good, reliable, stable object or early life experience of a good object is very important, and it's a failure of having a good object experience early in life that sets the predisposition to psychosis. Like for example, for Klein, inability to internalize a good, reliable, stable object was a centerpiece. For Winnicott, absence of good enough mothering was a difficulty, and he found it in psychosis in a variety of people. And in my opinion, also it's the same thing. I believe the first 3 months are critical. That in the first 3 months, if you have internalized a good, reliable, stable object, whatever extent it can be done in the first 3 months, or you experience the good object, then the core is created. And let us say you lose a good object, you experience a severe object loss after 6 months of age or 4 months of age. But even then, you had the first 3 or 4 months of very good object experience. So even after the first few months, even if the object loss happens, my feeling is that it leads more to personality disorders rather than to psychosis. Because a severe object loss is experienced, it is still early in life, but it is happening after a core of good object experience has happened. Of course, no idea covers the whole range of different personalities and pathologies, but this covers a large group of persons that I have encountered. Particularly in personality disorders, I find in most cases that uh, we have a situation where early life good experience was followed by a severe object loss. And in most cases, that object loss experience was fortified by difficult parents, difficult teachers, or difficult neighbors.
Yeah, this was the next question. How is object loss related to personality disorder? So can you elaborate a bit on that?
Uh, when I look at personality disorders, I don't see them in most cases to be uh, exactly as we find in DSM, very clear-cut clinical picture and only one disorder and nothing of the others. And this is something that a large group of psychiatrists also find the same thing. And there were a lot of discussions when this chapter was being rewritten and consultations were going on. One of the elements is that in most cases of personality disorders, we have one primary personality disorder which we are able to diagnose. But you always have a second, a number two, and number three personality disorder, Not to the extent that it can be diagnosed, but traits of those things are there. So it is from a DSM standpoint, it is one personality disorder with traces of other two. But from a psychoanalytic standpoint, we are dealing with a mixed personality disorder, even though one is primary and the others are in micro form. So when we look at that and when we try to figure out as to how it can happen so regularly in people, that people who come to us with dependent personality disorder, in a large number of them, we have a silent narcissistic, micro narcissistic set of traits. In so many of people who come to us with narcissism, we have silent histrionic traits. In so many of narcissistic people, we have silent dependent traits. In so many of schizoid people, we have silent narcissistic traits. So when we see these combinations, uh, and we try to theorize, there are a number of ways of theorizing. What I have theorized is the model that I have developed, the Valley Junction model, as I call it. It is a model where personality disorders are explained by early life object loss and the events which follow that object loss. So there is an early life severe object loss, then events happen following the object loss, and then the personality, based upon its unique constitution, tries to cope up with those events, the consequences of object loss. And in what way it copes up determines the kind of personality disorder that you develop. But because the first two parts, object loss and consequences of object loss, are generic to everyone, there is going to be a kind of a mixed personality disorder, kind of a cluster inside from a psychoanalytic standpoint. It's not going to be just one personality disorder. You resolve those traits of those disorder and it's gone. Just as you try to resolve one, you will start seeing traits of the other. So I believe the Valley Junction model is very important based upon object loss. And to me, object loss is very important element in analyzing and healing of all personality disorders. In fact, object loss, abandonment, guilt and shame, repressed pain and anger, helplessness and powerlessness, and use of defenses to overcome these feelings. This is something that you repeatedly encounter in all personality disorder treatments, healing of it, psychotherapy wise. So I think object loss is central to personality disorders. Maybe there is a small group where the personality disorder is because of other reasons, but in the majority of situations, it works.
Does object loss happening in the first 2 years of life affect the Oedipus complex?
Yes, very much so. Because we have not studied enough the effect of pre-Oedipal events on the Oedipal event. We have to be clear that the pre-Oedipal events are as important, in case some cases more important than the Oedipal event itself. I would say in most cases more important than the Oedipal event itself, because if we have a pre-Oedipal difficulty, and with that difficulty, if we go into the Oedipus, it is very unlikely that we will have a successful Oedipal phase. Let us say the split is open, unresolved. Severe object loss happens, unresolved. Severe anal phase problems happen, unresolved. Severe lack of mirroring, empathy, and idealization happens, unresolved. And with this baggage, you go into the Oedipal phase. It's very unlikely the Oedipal phase is going to be smooth. So in most people with severe pre-Oedipal difficulties, they are going to have Oedipal difficulties to different degrees. And often we find that unless those pre-Oedipal difficulties are addressed, it is difficult to heal the Oedipal difficulties. So object loss is one of the pre-Oedipal difficulties. There can be many pre-Oedipal difficulties, but object loss is one of them. And if object loss has happened, then unresolved object loss, with that when you go into Oedipus, very unlikely that Oedipus is going to be smooth and resolved. So we see that in most cases of object loss, whether we are talking of a personality disorder or generalized anxiety or a bipolar situation or a panic situation or even an addiction situation in some cases, in many of those situations, it is the pre-Oedipal difficulty which has led to an Oedipal difficulty along with other situations, events and situations in the environment, the kind of people who are around in the Oedipal phase, all of that put together. So we see that in those cases, we have to really address the pre-Oedipal issues before the Oedipus can be successfully taken.
Mr. Vaidya, there is these days a lot of talk about psychosomatic issues.
Right.
So, do you see the relevance of this concept of object loss to psychosomatic issues?
Very much so. Very much so. You can have psychosomatic issues because of variety of reasons. It can be because of prolonged attacks also. You can have bottled up rage, bottled up pain, which is happening over a period of time. And that is getting somatized because it cannot be expressed. That would be one line of psychosomatic difficulties. But another line of psychosomatic difficulties starts with early life object loss. That because of early life object loss, very intense anger, pain, guilt feelings arise. And they in turn become the nuclei for such more feelings to arise in future. And in order to deal with those feelings, defenses are used and a pathological personality structure gets created, which in turn creates this new problems of more anger and more pain and more frustration. Say, for example, you have early life object loss, and then you try to manage it by creating a narcissistic personality structure. And because of that narcissistic personality disorder, another layer of problems is created, that because of the narcissism, you are generating anxiety, you are generating intense rage, you are generating intense pain and repressed shame. And that in turn adds to that earlier stock of feelings. And now that the new stance is taken, it's a difficult stance to live in the world with, and that creates a set of its own problems and consequent negative feelings. So it is object loss leading to intense feelings, leading to defensive use of defenses, leading to a pathological state which you accept as normal, often in terms of personality disorders, often in terms of other disorders. And then that is, in its own wake, serially create a new set of negative emotions, which again are repressed in somatic. So we have this generation of two sets of emotions. One, because of early life object loss. Two, because of what the pathological stance that we have taken to cope with the object loss, that in its wake creates new problems. And this is a very common scene for psychosomatic group of persons.
So there is a direct link also, and there is an indirect link also to
Yes.
object loss in psychosomatic illnesses.
True. And therefore, we see that many people with early life object losses, which are fortified by events in their growing up years, they display this somatization defense. and have a lot of psychosomatic issues. However, if you have an early life object loss, but over the time experience with parents is good, and the child is able to express itself, we don't see so much of traumatization. And even if it is there, it is of mild category, not moderate or severe. What we usually call psychosomatic difficulties are moderate to severe difficulties, and they happen when the childhood object loss consequences, the consequences of the pathological state one goes into to manage the object loss. These two are fortified by difficult parents or difficult circumstances. It is this triad which is at the root of traumatization.
How is the object loss treated in therapy?
Now, this is an interesting question because it is such an important element, but we have not developed tools in psychoanalysis to really deal with it. We want it to happen by omission, that we don't do anything explicitly positive, but we don't do anything negative. We remain that anonymous, all accepting, amoral, non judgmental stance that we take, the neutral blank screen. And over a long period of time, we believe the person will internalize us as a good, reliable, stable object because of the stance that we take, and also because of his projection of good object onto us. So on one hand, he projects and he introjects. On the other hand, he sees in reality that we are non-judgmental and non-critical and non-attacking and all accepting, and at times insight provider, support provider, nourishment provider in a psychological sense, of course. So we generally look forward to high frequency of sessions and a long treatment for internalization of a good, reliable, stable object to take place unconsciously. We never say, okay, let us have 5 sessions to internalize good, reliable, stable object. So we hope that it will happen over a period of time unconsciously. And our belief is so strong that we actually believe it will happen inevitably. Unfortunately, we have not developed any tools to make it happen or to make it happen faster or better. And I think that is where we have to focus some attention. In general, in psychoanalysis, we are not good in tool development. And particularly on this point, we are even weaker in tool development. So one of the strongest of concepts and most important concepts of healing, for that we really don't have any tools of commission. With our stance uh, that we take, we accept it to we expect it to happen by itself. So what happens is that over a long period of time, when the person comes for therapy, because of our non-judgmental, neutral, compassionate stance, empathic stance, he internalizes us as a good, reliable, stable object. In some cases, it's interesting. Uh, it might be that the person had or has a situation of no object, that he wanted to internalize, but in real life, he did not have objects around him enough. So often there is a sequence in the mind that generally most people think a good object is better than no object is better than a bad object. Seems logical. But many people think the other way. They feel a good object is better than a bad object is better than no object. Compared to no object, they go for a bad object. The desperation for an object is so intense. And when people who are so lonely They come to therapy. Often they have a vacuum in their lives of different degrees. And for them, the presence of the object itself is a great facilitator for internalization.
Uh, is it true that despite knowing the price of being in this grip of object loss, many clients are unable to still get out of it? I mean, they remain stuck in that situation. And
True.
what do you think is the reason for this?
It is both true and tragic. Sorry. I call it the tragic holding state, the state in which a person is stuck and can't move out. This happens because of two reasons. One, because of past experience, either the person is too fearful to enter into a new object relation, or visiting the old object loss is too painful, and therefore mourning cannot happen and new relationships cannot happen. And this creates a difficulty that even when the therapist is present in therapy, even when people around him in society are offering themselves for a relationship, the person cannot get out of where he is stuck. So there is quite a large group of people who are stuck in this situation. On one hand, they want objects desperately. On the other, they fear the loss of object and pain so much because of past experiences, they dare not get attached again. So I want you, I don't want you. That paradox is something they are stuck in.
Is it the reason why there is so much engagement with social media and a lot of intellectualization also these days?
Yes, yes. We are trying to fulfill our need for objects, but we are so fearful of closeness that we want to keep all relationships in an optimum zone, not too far and not too close. So we are in the classical paradox of fear of abandonment on one hand and fear of closeness on the other. So somewhere we find a artificial safe space in between. But it is not a very healthy safe space. It's actually a dysfunctional safe space. So it's a good safe space if we start off from there and go somewhere. But if we just remain in that space, then it's a dysfunctional safe space. But we have become too touchy, and social media offers us such distance, even while we connect to each other, that real life connection now seems fearful because of the emotions it can create. So our emotional stamina, so to say, our emotional tolerance have gone down. The real life interaction seems to be too intense and too violent. So this is a difficulty, and I think it calls for training. We need to retrain ourselves in managing emotions, in tolerating emotions, and not to have that just about to run away kind of a stance which we take on social media.
True. Okay. Uh, Next question is, did Kohut and Sartre comment on object gain or object loss?
Yes, because uh, when it comes to the significance of objects in human life, or how to choose objects or how to let go of objects, quite a lot has been written. And people have taken very different positions. In spirituality, the whole goal is to be free from the need of objects. For Kohut, objects are seen as something very positive. So for Kohut, the other is the sunshine. The moment we have somebody in front of us, we become positive, we become energetic, we become motivated. And when we are lonely, we don't have people around us, we become depressed and uh, gloomy and without any energy and motivation. So that is one aspect of the objects, that objects are the sunshine. On the other hand, Sartre talks about the other element of the objects. He says the other is the hell. So the objects, particularly people as objects around us, they are the difficult part. That they don't allow or they don't act in a way that all our desires should come true. So we see two parts of the objects, that objects motivate us, energize us, make us positive. At the same time, some objects, particularly people as objects around us, they create hell for us or they don't allow our desires to come true. So both these paradoxically contradictory things are true about the objects, that the other is the sunshine and the other is the hell. And I think it takes us to a position where we have to think about what kind of objects we want and how to manage relating with them. So it becomes a question of contextuality and judiciousness. And nobody can be right all the time. One has to stumble through things. That's the only way out, it seems. But I think over a period of time, as we
And
learn more,
one can't even, yeah,
yeah, over a period of time, as we learn more, we stumble less.
yeah. Still, we can't say that somebody has become an expert in the matter.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah. This is
always
something like
a
stumble.
learning curve. Right, right, right. Next question is, Winnicott talked about the capacity to be alone. So, is it a negation of the concept of the object loss?
Uh, it appears like that from the surface, but deeply speaking, it is actually very different. You can be happy alone only when good object experiences have been internalized inside of you. So the capacity to be alone depends upon very good internalization of good, reliable, stable objects. So if you had enough experiences of good objects around you and you were able to internalize it, it can cause what Kohut calls transmuting internalization. That you have adequate stock of good objects inside with whom you identify. And after these things have become one, you don't feel lonely when alone. So Winnicott talks about the capacity to be alone. It is not the capacity to be lonely. So the capacity to be alone happens when we have internalized adequately good, reliable, stable object. And similarly, spirituality also has this goal, because if you are going to live alone in Himalayas or all alone somewhere, or you want to be free from objects, you can be free from objects when you are free from desires, or when you have adequately internalized good objects inside, that you don't need them from outside. So even on the spiritual path, managing objects is a very important element.
So, like we have talked about psychology dealing with this concept and theme of object loss. From what you said, it seems like that spirituality also engages with this concept of object loss, maybe in a very different way.
Very, very different. When there are many important elements in this regard. First is, uh, the goal of spirituality is to be free from objects. And free from objects means free from dependence on the objects. That one should not start feeling restless, desperate, and pathological when one does not have objects around or does not have good objects around. That is one part. Now, if you have to train yourself for that, spirituality is a basket full of tools. And the most important tool is of idol therapy, of entering, of creating objects of particular types, both in real world material as well as in personality terms, and then relating to those objects, internalizing them, right? Identifying with them, and then sort of through some method creating an inner alchemy whereby the dependence on objects is reduced. So that is one part. The second part is on the spiritual path, often one goes through certain phases which are very much like the phases of object loss a child goes through. In some of the Buddhist traditions, uh, the whole idea of feeling the disintegration and the loneliness inside is very much a part of the process. And what they describe there as certain states you have to go through after certain training are very much the states a person would go through as a child after feeling abandoned. So this whole feeling of disintegration, abandonment, chaos inside is very much a, a developmental stage in the spiritual sense on the path toward freedom from objects. And lastly, the freedom from object once achieved does not necessarily mean shunning of the objects, but to relate to objects without attachment and dependence. So it is not object boycott or shunning of the object, it is the mastery over the dependence. So spirituality has this different ideas on this idea on this concept of object loss, and every spiritual school has variety of techniques to somehow manage this. The ashram kind of environment and the presence of the guru that also facilitates this whole process. The whole mythological elements, the mythological world, the spiritual gods and goddesses, particularly in the Hindu context, the kind of uh, rich world we have of mythology, gods and goddesses, and enlightened masters and their stories. That whole ecosystem helps us to heal and move forward on this whole area of object management in the inner world.
So can we say that in spirituality, this phenomenon of object loss and its experience and all that is just seen as a part of the process, not as a problem?
That is both a strength as well as weakness. Strength because they see it as a developmental problem and they have creative tools to somehow address it. I'm sure at times they would be succeeding, at times they would not be succeeding, but they do have quite a reasonable inventory to work this problem with. On the other hand, the weakness is that when the pathology is severe, they don't really have a kind of a very elemental understanding of the type we have in psychoanalysis, and therefore many times they are not able to address it. And in such situations, it is better to first go into psychoanalytic psychotherapy and then go into spirituality.
So can in such cases, can spirituality and psychoanalysis in some form or the other come together to
Very
make
much,
the person go through the process?
very much so. Many people actually do it. In fact, patients have become far more eclectic and holistic than even the therapists know about. So there are many people who are simultaneously going to psychotherapy as well as to spiritual schools and practicing spiritual techniques. In India, it's very common.
So they can kind of come together to help the person. So a confluence of
Yes,
both these things in some
if we
way.
can if we can become more open and see science in a more wider term, and look at life and the journey of the person in a wider context, we can come together and create a holistic healing plan. Unfortunately, it is still some time away. People are still very closely caught up in their areas.
Yeah, it's like very compartmentalized.
It is. And my feeling is in the next 25 years, we will see holistic healing emerging, where spirituality and psychoanalysis and many other elements will come together to offer holistic healing to people.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Vaidya, for this wonderful discussion on this topic, which is a very classic topic, but which is gone into the margins of the discourse. Thank you for bringing it back again. And I hope it helps the listeners to understand and go into it in a much deeper way. Thank you so much. Do write to us at the rate at hvindia@gmail.com. Namaste.
Namaste.